Everyone, Happy New Year. It's so nice to see you all this morning. I hope you had a very nice holiday. As we kick off the new year, this new semester of the Rector's Bible Study, just a quick note, our schedule bookmarks will be here, I think, actually today. So we don't have them for you this morning, but if you've got the fall bookmark, you've got today's and next week's lessons on the back of that bookmark. And the digital version has been emailed to everyone who gets our email list, and it's available on our website. So if you want to check ahead of over the next few weeks, then you're welcome to either look at your emails or look at our website. But we will have the bookmarks for you next week. And so we're doing Hannah today, Abigail next week. So unless you read many weeks in advance, you should be right as rain. And so as we continue with our Women in the Bible study, we have a couple weeks here with characters that you may not necessarily know well. And I think it's really neat to lift up some of these characters like Hannah, where their stories are quite small in total length in the Bible, but they have really great resonance. And so we're going to look at the way that Hannah's story actually impacts not only the great arc of salvation, but also how she, as such a real person, can actually help instruct us as we live our lives day to day. And so I hope that both this week and next week with Abigail and another very short story but has some good resonance will be kind of neat for us, because these are stories that are not often told. They were definitely not told to me in seminary. And so digging in a bit and figuring out how these characters can illuminate faith for us is going to be very helpful. And so I'm glad we're doing it. Let's kick off with a prayer, and we'll get started. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, in this new year, we ask your blessing upon us. Help to calm our hearts and minds, open them so that you can fill them with your Spirit, and keep us mindful of the blessings that you give us in this new year. We come to you today with grateful hearts, and we offer before you prayers for those in our lives who need extra support, especially those who may be sick. We offer those up to you that our prayers and your love will sustain them. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so like I said, Hannah is a story that we don't often hear much about. And so we're going to separate Hannah's story into 5 sections today. First, we're going to talk about historic context, what the story really is, the big moments. And then the story itself will be separated into 4 groups. We're going to talk about Hannah's suffering, her prayer, her obedience, and then her song. And so we're going to start with some historic context. So who is Hannah? How does she fit? Where does she fit? Why does she matter? Hannah comes to us toward the end of the period of Judges. And so to put that into context, we have the wilderness period, and the Israelites come in and they conquer a good amount of the promised land. And we enter this period of the Judges that's about 200 years, from 1200 to 1000 BCE. And that period of Judges is disparate in its political unity. So we don't have a unified Israel yet. That comes in the period of the kings that follows the period of the Judges. With the Judges, you have all the different tribes of Israel on different plots of land in essentially where the nation of Israel is today, not exactly, but relatively close. And each of those tribes are running themselves the best that they can. But as human nature accounts with the biblical story over and over again, humanity falls short and we distance ourselves from God and we make bad decisions. And so in order to reconcile us back to God, to renew us to God, we have judges. And those judges come up out of each individual tribe, and they are essentially leaders who help to bring the people back to God. So as I've said before, don't think judge behind a bench with a black coat necessarily, although sometimes they function similarly. What they really are the people who bring everyone back and renew faithfulness in God when people have gone astray. Into that period of the Judges, we come to the end of that period, and what we need as a transition is a prophet who will help usher in the period of the kings. That prophet's name is Samuel. and his mother's name is Hannah. And so Samuel becomes the prophet who anoints Saul as the first king over Israel. But Saul is not the one who genuinely unifies Israel. That will be their second king, David. Samuel also anoints David as king, but before Saul has died. And that then becomes a big dramatic mess. And you can listen to Bible study from a couple years ago if you want that whole story. But Samuel is the prophet who helps to refocus the people of Israel toward Yahweh. Samuel's also the prophet who says to Israel, you don't really want a king. Your king is God. And yet the people say, well, everyone else has a king, and we want what everyone else has. And so then Samuel reluctantly anoints Saul as the first king, and it doesn't really work out so well for the people. And then, of course, we know king after king after king devolves into what will ultimately become the exile in the future. Okay, so we've got this period here where we are transitioning out of the judges and into the kings. And the big transition character is Samuel. But Samuel lives his life in a very particular way because of what his mother Hannah does. And so Hannah's story sets up the big pivotal prophet of Israel that takes them from the judges to the kings. And so we're going to look at Hannah's story here today because it impacts the great big arc for generations to come. A few textual notes that we need to make sure we're all clear about. The religious center for most of the Israelites, not all, but most, is in Shiloh. It is not in Jerusalem yet. If we remember back to our story of where Jerusalem comes from, what's the other name of Jerusalem that people often say? It's the city of David. David's not here yet. And so Jerusalem has not become important yet to the nation of Israel. When David becomes king, David brings the Ark of the Covenant. That's not true. Before David becomes king, David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and establishes Jerusalem as the core religious center of the nation. Before that, the primary, although there were others that jockeyed for position, city that was important to the Israelites is Shiloh. And so Shiloh is where Hannah and her family will go to worship. And the reason they don't go to worship in Jerusalem is because that's not happening yet. Shiloh prefigures Jerusalem. Additionally, we need to know that Hannah is one of two wives of Elkanah. And Hannah's sister wife, in a sense, is Peninnah. Peninnah has lots of kids. Hannah does not. So we have, again, the same kind of cyclical story where the core protagonist of the story, the person who is going to show the greatest faithfulness to God, is the person who, as the text tells us, her womb has been closed by God. And so she suffers, she struggles. She has to figure out what it means to not be able to do the thing that she is really supposed to do as a good Jewish woman, which is to have children. And so here Hannah is, barren, when the other wife of her husband seems to be very good at procreating. And so that's part of Hannah's big struggle. Hannah represents one of the core ideas of most biblical stories, which is that sense of going through tough times, maintaining some kind of faithfulness to God, and then being renewed in one's faith because the ultimate purpose of God is fulfilled in the future. So Hannah plays that role for us, and that's where I think her story becomes most instructive today. Now, one last note before we jump into the text itself. We're going to be talking a significant amount today about prayer and how prayer functions and how prayer works for Hannah. And I know that over the years, we've had many dynamic discussions about prayer here. And so I'm planting the seed now. So in 20 or 30 minutes, when we really get into that prayer section, if you've got some questions or observations, or if you've wondered stuff from years ago when we've had discussions on prayer, then I'm giving you the chance to get that together so you can ask some good questions. And of course, those of you watching online, if you have questions you put in the chat, we'll get to them next week. All right, questions about historic context before we get into the text itself. I'm so glad it's clear. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zephite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So we'll stop there. Sets up the story nice and clear. There's a guy, he's got 2 wives. One is good at having children, the other cannot seem to. Okay, so here's the situation. Hannah is already from the jump set up as having some struggles. Because we remember that having children is not only purposeful, but it's also where you get security and wealth and all of the other things. So Hannah's story begins with this idea of suffering, and her suffering is complex. In previous stories, we have seen some women who suffer from barrenness, but they suffer in a sense on their own, and they're left to try to figure things out on their own. Think of someone like Sarah. She was kind of by herself, not able to have kids. Then we have others where, think of Leah and Rachel, where you've got a person who's able to have lots and lots of children, and the other is watching the person have a bunch of children and being frustrated herself that she cannot seem to. Hannah's is the latter. And Hannah's story is not only one where she is actively and on the daily compared to a woman who seems to be able to have as many children as she needs, but we learn that Peninnah is also not a very nice person. She does not allow Hannah to suffer silently. Instead, she rubs her nose in it all the time about Hannah not being able to have kids. If we keep going with verse 3, now this man used to go up year by year from his town to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on, year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Okay, we'll stop there because there's so many things wrong with this. So let's start with Peninnah's a jerk. So here we have set up that Elkanah seems to be a pretty decent, faithful man. He's going up to Shiloh year by year. So year by year, remember that in the future with the temple, there is that annual pilgrimage that people would go to the temple to worship. At this period of time, there are not individual places to worship where you live. So there will be a point in time where there are individual spots, kind of like the way we have lots and lots of different churches. You will get different places that will be called little temples where people can worship in their own hometowns. At this period of time, when you want to go worship God, God is in one place, and God is represented by the priests, and God is there in Shiloh. And so it is just not functional for most people who are either growing plants or herds to go regularly out of town to worship somewhere else. And so there is this rhythm of once a year, you make a pilgrimage and you go and you sacrifice. And when you go and you sacrifice, you essentially collect a bunch of things from the sacrifice after you have given thanks to God, and then you celebrate the sacrifice by giving gifts to your family. And so what we are discussing here in this story is that Elkanah goes up and he sacrifices, and then he comes back and he essentially gives gifts to all his family members. And what the storyteller tells us is that Elkanah is doing exactly what he's supposed to do and giving everybody a portion, including Peninnah and all of her kids. But to Hannah, he gives a double portion. And this sets up a very interesting dynamic where Hannah is loved, which kind of implies Peninnah isn't. Hannah gets a double portion, but Hannah's upset because Peninnah's over here being a jerk, and she loses her appetite because she can't conceive and bear children. And so Elkanah comes and gives her a double portion of what she doesn't want to eat because she's lost her appetite. And so you have this compounding of the complexity of her suffering. In addition, we have Elkanah, who is, I suppose we can say, doing his best. But what happens when Elkanah sees that Hannah is suffering? He says, "Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Oh, nice try. That's not, like, how many in here feel like that's the way to comfort someone who is sad? That's not how that works. And so Elkanah just doesn't get it. And so here Hannah is, Peninnah's being a jerk, Elkanah is obtuse, and even though by all accounts like a good guy, not really helping. And so Hannah's suffering is also something done on an island. You know, she is very much alone in this suffering. So not only does she have this mean woman with her, but she seems to be misunderstood by her husband. Into that suffering, Hannah actually has a highly faithful response. Hannah continues to worship God. And so where she could say, "I am being wronged by God," Hannah says, "I'm going to keep worshiping." It's obviously not working. Hannah is praying for a child. It's what she wants. She is openly saying that's what she wants, and yet she's not getting what she wants, which for a lot of people means God's being mean. I will no longer worship. Hannah does not make that choice. Instead, Hannah remains faithful to God. Now, does Hannah understand in some way that there is purpose in her life? Maybe. The storyteller doesn't say that. But we can assume that there is something in Hannah that keeps her connected to God, even when other people might find that God is ignoring them, and so disconnect. We've talked in here before about worship and prayer not being a way to get what you want. That we don't, I've used before, that God is not a cosmic vending machine, where if you do the right thing, you put the right change into the machine, you get the item out you want. It's like you put the right prayer in, then you get the thing you want. And yet, it's so easy to accidentally live life thinking that we're supposed to go to God with prayers and requests and then get the thing that we requested. God doesn't function that way. And prayer is not actually meant to function that way. Prayer is meant to shape us. And we see that example here with Hannah, where Hannah's not getting what she wants, and she prays anyway. And it's that constant, continuous prayer and praise of God, even when she is going through suffering, that is actually shaping her. It's not convincing God to do the thing that she wants. It's allowing her to be shaped by her suffering and by her faithfulness into a different kind of person in the future, a different kind of person who will ultimately do what she does, because an unformed, immature spiritual person would never do what Hannah ultimately does with her child. But having been formed so deeply in the crucible of her suffering, actually prepares her to do a very significant, we might say heroic, kind of obedient act to God. So, in verse 7, we see that Hannah wept and would not eat, and her grief is really overwhelming for her. We also hear that the storyteller says God had closed her womb. Now, just a side note, before anyone asks why God would do that, remember that that is what the storyteller is attributing to God. It isn't necessarily because God said to the storyteller, "Write this down." But in the story, in the way that people understood things like pregnancy and childbirth, it was God's intent to give a person a child. And so if a person did not conceive, then it must figure that it's God's intent that they not. And so there was no consideration of genetics and all that sort of stuff. It was, if I got pregnant, God wanted me to. If I didn't get pregnant, God does not want me to. And so God either opens or closes wombs. That's the way people understood it. It is important for us to know that's the context so that we don't attribute too much of the intentionality of God closing the womb the way the storyteller has attributed. We can be a bit more sophisticated than that because we know more than what they knew back then. Let's see. I think that's all I want to say about the whole suffering bit. Questions about that? Or perhaps questions around the way that the suffering is portrayed in this story, or in your own life, how perhaps suffering has been experienced in a way that could help us connect more deeply to this story. I see a few new faces out there, and so I just want to note that it takes the average person 7 to 9 seconds to form a question, which is why I pause and wait.
Hannah never questions the Lord, does she? She just loves him and is
Yeah, Hannah.
She never questions him.
Hannah does not question. So on the one hand, it's very virtuous, and it's a lovely example for us. I would love to say I would be that patient, I would be that faithful. I don't know. I've not, I think, experienced that kind of frustration, and so I can't say whether I would or would not. I would hope that having spent years of working on myself, that I would be faithful in the face of that. I certainly tell people to do that, but I think that her example is both really excellent and also can be challenging, because I think when we go through genuine deep suffering and we look at someone like Hannah, although she can, for some, be a light in the darkness and say, I can, here's an example, I can do that. Some people, and I would put myself in the latter category, actually kind of like the people who get angry, because that's my love language, is anger. And so I want to be frustrated and and yell. And so I'm the kind of person who loves the Psalms when the Psalms get really frustrated and angry, because that feels cathartic to me. God is still there, and God still wants all of that. I think God wants the people who are patient and lovely and will come regardless of what's going on in their life, however hard it gets, and the people who will stay connected and keep coming even if they come with that anger. That's one of the reasons I like how we worship as Episcopalians, is because you don't have to be happy when you come to worship. You don't have to even want to be there. You can be really annoyed, frustrated, angry with God, and you still come, because that's the way it's built, is that you bring yourself to God. God doesn't want us only when we're feeling faithful and hopeful and happy. God wants us. And however we feel, God wants us to come. And so when people say things like, well, I didn't go to church because I didn't feel good enough, or I couldn't get myself together, what they're really saying is wear the right kind of clothes and look as good as they're supposed to do when they come to church. And I sympathize, but I do want us to know that when you feel the most messy is when you should really come to church. When you feel put together and everything's good and you're looking good and everything, that's fine, come. But it's when you're a big mess and you're not sure which way is up, that's actually when you should really come to church, because that's when God is there to hold you. We often say things like, we can't carry the weight of our life on our own. That's where God comes in. God helps to carry the weight that we cannot carry when it is too heavy.
Was Hannah a big mess when she prayed?
Oh my gosh, yeah. We hear she was a big fat mess. So we have, Elkanah is saying, I
see her as
actually, she's such a mess that in a minute, Eli, the priest, is going to think she's actually drunk because she's such a mess. So not only is she crying and she's not eating, in a minute, she's going to be praying so hard that words aren't even coming out of her mouth, and yet her mouth is still moving, and Eli will think she's drunk. So in my mind, we've got a woman who is drowning in her pain and her suffering. And she has every excuse to no longer go worship. And yet she still shows up and she still worships. And is she still hopeful? So I can answer that one of two ways. One is we don't know, we are not told that she is hopeful. But I think in some way, if you are still showing up, you've got to have some hope in you. It can be real small, but there's got to be some nugget in you that says, this is not the end, and that there is more to come. And you are holding on to, I think I would describe it as the hopefulness that the suffering and the pain is not all there is, that there is something beyond it. But I do think that for the people, I mean, we all know this now, but back then I'm not sure how common it was to say it out loud, which is you don't stop feeling pain. You work through it. You don't just stop suffering. You have to push all the way through it and essentially get to the other side of it before healing can begin. And so I see Hannah as representing, whether she knew it or not, the sense of she's just going to push through and she's going to keep showing up, knowing that at some point, God will do something. And I think that I'm very comfortable calling that hope. I saw another hand in the back. Yes. Well, you ruined the next section of my teaching. Yes. So your observation is just right. Hannah's prayer shifts over time. At the beginning, she's praying for a very tangible, in a sense, worldly outcome. She wants a child. And so she is praying for a child. Over the years, her prayer evolves. And although I certainly think she still wants a child, her prayer evolves into asking for God's will to be done. And that's a really important shift. And so I'm glad you picked up on it. And that will be in the next section where we talk about her prayer, because she is not only suffering and staying static. What the storyteller is trying to get us to see is that her suffering and her pain and her continued presence with God is changing her. So she's not simply doing the same thing year on year on year. She's allowing the experience to change who she is, how she understands herself, how she understands her relationship with God. That prayer is meant to deepen her relationship with God, and we do see that in the next section of the chapter. And so let's go ahead and transition, because that gets us right there. So third section for today, we're going to talk about her prayer and her vow. So her prayer becomes a vow that she makes to God. So let's look, continuing in chapter 1, verse 9. After they'd eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow: O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. Okay, we'll break this apart a little bit. So first off, I just want to note so that we're all clear. After they'd eaten and drunk at Shiloh, they went and presented themselves before the Lord, and they were at the temple. I think just because it's everything we've ever known, you get up, you go to church, and you come home from church. When you have to travel from one city to another, and that's a once-in-a-year pilgrimage, This is not a couple hours out of your day. This is multiple days. And so what people would do is they would leave their home, they would bring a lot of supplies, they would go to the temple, and they would stay. They would sleep multiple nights wherever the temple was. So at this point in Shiloh. And so they're in Shiloh a few days. And so they would kind of travel a day, they would sleep, and then they would get up the next day, and that's when they would go to worship, and they'd probably sleep again, and then they'd travel back that third day. So you're talking about 3-day minimum to make this trip to Shiloh. For some people, it would be longer. So the way the story sets this up is not, I just want to give you the context. That's why they ate and they drank, and then they got up and they went to the temple. They're there for a few days. What we see in this prayer is that Hannah still really wants what she wants. She wants a male child, but what has shifted is the purpose of having a child. It had been that Hannah wanted a child because women are supposed to have children. And women are supposed to have children if they are good Jewish women, and it helps to build up their family. And in a sense, that child is really to serve them, to serve the family. For Hannah, through this suffering, she's gotten to a place where she understands that the child belongs to God. She wants to fulfill God's will for her. It is very, very important for us to know we need to put our modern sensibilities aside and to say that at this point in time, the Israelites, the Jewish people, understood their purpose by God to procreate. And so it's not just their self-fulfillment. They are actually created to have children, and it is their created purpose to have those children to fulfill God's purpose. And if they do not fulfill God's purpose, then they, in some very tangible way, are not doing what God made them to do. That's not how Hannah started. But she has actually gotten to the place where she still wants a child, but not to keep him. She wants a child because that then fulfills who God made her to be. And she wants so desperately to fulfill her purpose that she says she will give the child back to God. I mean, literally, give the child. And when we see as a Nazirite, what that actually means is that the child would be raised as a holy person and completely committed to that life. So what she is saying here is, I'll have the child, and we'll find out later that she will nurse the child, basically get him to essentially like a young toddler. But then at that point, she is committing to give that child to the temple, to live, to serve God his whole life. When you hear no razor shall touch his head, what's that sound like? There's another Nazirite you know. Samson. Samson was a Nazirite. There's another Nazirite you know. John the Baptist. So it's a way of being where essentially you don't change who God made you to be. And so one of the representative ways in which you do not change is you do not cut your hair. God made you, your hair grows, the end. Which is why, of course, we get the story of Samson. When ultimately his hair was cut, he lost his strength. It's a vow that is made to God. And Hannah's making that vow on behalf of her future child, Samuel. And then Samuel will live not only in the temple, but then become this prophet of God. The nature of Hannah's prayer is what we would call in Scripture a lament. There are many different kinds of prayers, and Hannah will have a different kind of prayer in a moment. But this prayer here is a prayer of lament. She is being very honest and vulnerable to God. And as she continues her prayer, that lament overwhelms her so much that she looks kind of crazy. So continue chapter 1, verse 12. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. So I love this transition period because what we get here is Hannah shifts. Hannah shifts in a very significant way because not only is she there making this prayer and this vow, but she also gets a blessing articulated to her. And so Eli, the priest, who is representative of God's presence, sees that what she is doing is highly faithful. And in that faithful act, what does he say? "Go in peace and may your petition be granted." That's important. Hannah hears that word as a deep connection to God. And then she goes back to eat and drink that night, having worshiped at Shiloh, and her face was no longer sad. I mean, there is a moment here where something shifts in Hannah. Now, she is not, what we have not heard yet, is she is not pregnant. And so when we think of what she has actually asked, she has asked for a child. What shifts in her is hearing this prayer of blessing, this validation of her pain and her petition. And hearing that kind of validation and having gone through the formative process that she has gone through with year after year of bringing everything she had to God, of pouring her soul out to God, when she hears that blessing of peace, all of a sudden, she's no longer sad. She hasn't gotten the tangible thing that she wanted, but what she actually received was what she needed, and it was that peace. And that peace helped her suffering to fall away. And she went back no longer sad. It's a powerful moment because when we are going through our suffering and feeling anxious and feeling lost, often think that we need the thing that we are praying for. We need our loved one to heal. We need the job that we lost. We need the child that we have wanted. We need. And we think at the beginning that until we get what we know we need, we will no longer be happy. And yet, over the formative experience of continuing to pray and relate to God and connect deeply in faith to God, Hannah realizes it's not what she needs, but it's what only God can provide. It is that peace. And those of us who have gone through genuine deep suffering and have come out the other side, I think understand that peace is the most powerful thing that we can receive. Because many of us, I know many of you, and I know some of the things that you have gone through, and I know you didn't get what you wanted. You may have prayed very hard for someone not to die, or to be lost to you, or to get the thing that you thought would fulfill you, and you did not get it, or you lost the person. And yet that peace when we come through the suffering that God gives us, is actually the deepest thing that we need. Now, would it be nice to have not lost? Of course. But the loss then becomes part of what deepens who we are and our understanding of what is actually real. And that helps us to get to a place where we understand that what we see is not all there is. And that death is not the end, it is simply the next step. And that perhaps we are behind in that process than those we love, but we are all still on this journey toward God, and we will, along with those we love and see no longer, reach the point at which God's peace will completely consume, overwhelm, and transform us. And Hannah, in a sense, gets a glimpse of that peace right here, and she's no longer sad. Then we get to where God remembers Hannah. questions about her prayer or her vow. Okay. Chapter 1, verse 19. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. Okay, we'll pause there. God remembered Hannah. It's an odd phrase, but it is a very biblical phrase. We hear this phrase in multiple stories all the way throughout the Bible. There is a sense that God hears the petition. What I want us to resist is this sense that somehow the person has persisted enough that God finally gives in. Or the literal reading of this phrase, which is God was ignoring or forgetting the person. And then finally God remembers and does the thing that God would have done a while earlier had God just not forgotten. It is not literal. This is one of those phrases that is really meant to be deeply theological. And I think Hannah's story articulates it as good as any other story, which is Hannah gets to a point where she has been changed so deeply that now who she is and who God made her to be has merged. And she is now fulfilling her great purpose. And it's what we said earlier, which is she has gotten to where her prayer is no longer, I want a child. Her prayer is that God's will be done in her life as she was purposed. And so then she gets filled with this peace and she conceives. Now, I don't know about you, but I have so many stories of people in my life who struggle to get pregnant, and they struggle. And they try a whole bunch of things, and they spend lots of money and many years, and they are so anxious and they are so sad. And then they finally give up and they adopt a child, and months after they receive their adopted child, they get pregnant. There is, in a sense, a giving over that is important to faith. This is why I say regularly that people who are really good at the world, who can build security and build wealth and are super able and competent and successful and all the other stuff, it is the hardest for those people to understand the actual gift of Jesus. Because the whole idea here is that we give ourselves over and we are saved from the world. Well, if the world is really good to us, why do we need to be saved from it? And so what we see in this story of Hannah is what it means to give ourselves over. And it is, in a sense, that giving over of ourselves that helps us to merge with God, to find that peace, to anchor ourselves in something that is godly and not self-centered. And that's when we really open ourselves up to who God made us to be. Now, we can, any of us, make choices in our lives that are about us. And we can go for a long time with those choices. But if we find ourselves stuck, most of the time when we are stuck because we have chosen the path ourselves rather than trying to respond to God, and we've essentially reached the dead end. Now, it might take us a while. It could take us a few months. It could take us decades. But at some point, we hit that wall, and we think, what has God done? No, that's not God. That's us choosing our own self-centeredness rather than learning to respond to God's voice. I mean, we talk all the time about listening to God's voice. It takes training. It's like, can you just get up one day off the sofa and run a marathon? No. You have to train. The same comes with being able to hear God, being able to feel God and respond to God's nudges and bumps and lead so that we actually make choices that draw us closer to who God would love for us to be, the purpose that we have been made for. Hannah has gone through this crucible and is now on that path. And yes, of course, she conceives and she has a child, sure. But I believe that what Hannah has done here is understood that the worldly pressure of having a child is no longer in front of her. That's been put to the side. Instead, she has become a vessel of God's great purpose. And having a child is being that vessel. But it's no longer because the world expects it. It's because she has a gift to play as part of God's great story and the arc of God's salvation. And she came to a place where she was able to not only accept it, but choose it. And then everything happens. Let's continue. Verse 21. The man Elkanah and all his household went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up. For she said to her husband, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and remain there forever. I will offer him as a Nazirite for all time. Her husband Elkanah said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until he was weaned. When she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. She left him there for the Lord. So we can read this section, and I think a lot of people would respond at first, like, how in the world could she do this? How could she just leave her child? Like, this child she had wanted for so long, how could she just turn him over? Because what happens, remember, Shiloh is not around the corner in her town. She's not going to happen to run into Samuel going to the well or some version of that. Samuel's gone. And maybe she will see Samuel when she goes up to Shiloh to worship with her family. But Samuel's not going to know her in the way that a mother would like to be known by her children. She has given this child up to God. It's an amazing example of the way that Hannah has been transformed. She is no longer yoked or tied to what the world would say is how she should be. She has understood her purpose by God and not by the world. And so for her, she hands Samuel over to be a Nazirite, to serve God, to be there in the temple forever for good. And it seems, at least the storyteller says, that she just kind of says, here, I prayed for him, God gave him to me, and now I'm giving him back to God. There are a number of things we can say here. The first is, she has figured out the key to, I think, what is discipleship writ large, which is none of this belongs to any of us. Everything belongs to God. And when we give thanks for what God has given to us, and we understand that it does not belong to us, that it always belongs to God, then what we do is we free ourselves from being tied down to what the world says is most valuable. I remember hearing when I was a kid someone say something about, we do every year, we ask for people to make pledges, money in this year of service. And I remember someone saying when I think I was a teenager, that God gives you everything you have and lets you keep 90% of it. And I thought, that is a flip way of talking about tithing, which is, we often think we get, and then out of the goodness of our hearts, we give back something to say thank you to God, when actually the deepest, most faithful position is for us to understand this does not belong to us in the first place. God really only wants us to give enough back to where we remember every year, every day, every month, every year, whatever it takes, that what we have is not ours. So whatever it takes, that's why I will often say to people when they say, how much should I give? You should give enough so that you know you are giving. So if 2% of your income is a reminder every week because you know you are giving enough to make your life change because of your giving, great. If you give 10% and it's on interest income that you would never see and nothing about your life ever changes, that's not enough because it's not about the amount. It's about the regular reminder to you that you are grateful for what you have been given and that it doesn't belong to you. That's what discipleship is all about. And Hannah got there. Now, she only got there through suffering, but she got there. It is the people who have suffered the most who tend to be the ones who understand this the best. I have often said that if you want to find real faithful people, you go to an addiction recovery group. Because the people who have recovered from addiction of any kind, the people who are in recovery from addiction of any kind understand the first truth, which is they are not in control. They cannot do it on their own. Once you actually admit and anchor yourself in that truth, then the rest of it becomes just natural. For most of us, unless we have gone through genuine tragedy, crisis, or suffering, we never have to actually admit that we are not in control. And if we haven't ever had to do that, then our faith is likely tenuous. Those who have had to go through those really, really hard times and have gone through and maintain their faithfulness, man, that faithfulness is real and it is deep and it is a source for everyone else around them. And that's really what we see in Hannah's life. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop there for this section. Any questions before we get to Hannah's song? Yes. Yeah, so the comment is, I found it interesting that she has a pretty decent relationship with the priest and doesn't seem to kind of have the same relationship with her husband. And I think that's exactly right. And I think what we have, the way the storyteller is setting it up is that Hannah's relationship in her life that is primary and most important is the relationship she has with God. That has become the key relationship in her life. Eli represents God. So I think it's less that Hannah's relationship is with Eli than it is that Hannah's relationship is with a priest of God. I mean, it happens to be Eli because he's the priest there, but Eli's, in a sense, speaking on behalf of God. This is where it gets tricky for people who are in those roles because we always represent God to people. You know, it's like people who have been hurt or abused or anything like that by a priest often will say, that's God. And they will kind of conflate God with the human. And I get it. It makes total sense. And it's also so unfortunately wrong because the human fallibility and the human sinfulness is never going to represent God completely. And yet, priests or whomever can still say words that people need to hear that are actually words from God and not from the person. And so there's always that balance. I will never forget when I was a chaplain intern and I was deciding that I would pursue ordination, my supervisor said, becoming ordained is the fastest way to lose your soul. And I thought that was so dramatic. And I was like, please. And then when I thought about it, I realized that's actually what she's talking about. Because the responsibility is so significant when people believe you to speak God's words that you can also then begin to abuse that responsibility. And a person who does not have that responsibility could make similar choices to one who does, and the one who does have that responsibility and makes bad choices in that role is essentially worse than the person who does not have the responsibility. And so I got it it took a while for me to understand what she was talking about. But I see Eli representative of God in that way. For Hannah, I think Hannah's story is really about her relationship with God. And so poor Elkanah, who again seems like a perfectly nice person, also just kind of seems like a doofus. And so, at first he's like, am I not good enough for you? And she's like, oh my God, it's not about you. And then you see this moment where she's like, I'm going to go give my child to the temple. And Elkanah's like, whatever you think. And that's not, on the one hand, supportive, but also that not really. Like, you don't want Elkanah's kind of like, not my problem, that's really, and that's not relational. And so Elkanah just kind of comes off as sort of, a zero in this story. But I don't really think Elkanah is really the point. I think really what we see is Hannah's faithfulness again and again with God, representative to Eli. And then of course what we get, you all know the story of the phrase like, here I am, that really is first used with Samuel. So we'll remember, like, in the next few chapters, what happens is Samuel's a child and he's asleep and he hears God's voice, and Eli doesn't understand what is happening with Samuel the first few times until it clicks for Eli and he says, go tell God you're listening. Like, you are there and you are listening. And that puts Samuel on this path of really being able to relate well with God. And so Eli plays an important role both with Hannah and with Samuel. And what I like about the way that Eli is portrayed is he's got just enough human weakness to understand that he is not God. But he's also faithful enough. So, he accuses Hannah of being drunk until Hannah says, I'm not drunk, I am just suffering. And then it's like he pivots and he says, oh, well then here's a blessing, with peace. Okay, good. Good for him. He probably should have started there, but that's okay. Then you get this moment where Samuel's hearing the voice, and Eli, probably should have actually understood what was going on at first because duh. But once he figures it out, he gives Samuel, puts him on the right path. I kind of like that sort of priest because I feel like that's much more me. I know many colleagues who they're holy all the time and they are so responsive faithfully all the time. And that is so nice. And I tend to get it wrong first. And then I'm like, oh, that's right. And so I kind of like Eli. He's my guy. Okay, so let's jump into Hannah's song in these last few minutes because I think it's so pretty. We've come to the point with Hannah where she's had her child, she's committed the child to God, really, really faithful. And then we get Hannah's song. And so like a few others in Scripture, she has done everything that is faithful, and her story could end there and she is superb. But that's not it for her. She comes back and she has this moment of praise that is so beautiful and so profound. If you have not actually read the first 10 verses of chapter 2, then go home. I'm going to read a portion of it to you, but go home and read it, and maybe read it a few times. It's wonderful. And so chapter 2, Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord. No one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low. He also exalts, and on and on. This goes again and again and again to articulate how well-formed Hannah has become and how her capacity to understand her own suffering and the way of the world and how God relates to the world is incredibly powerful. So much so that many scholars believe that it is Hannah's song that creates the theology through which all of Israel's history should be seen. And so this song is critically important to the theological understanding of the way that God will relate to Israel, not just right now in her life, but the way the storyteller will tell the story of Israel writ large. The judges, the kings, the exile, the return and rebuilding of the temple, that Hannah's song gives us all of the theological understanding and boundaries to understand what God is doing, so much so that we get another really important song from a first-time mother who gives her child over to God's service. And that comes in the first chapter of Luke. And so we hear Hannah say, "My heart exults in the Lord." Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Hannah says, "Talk no more so very proudly, for the Lord is a God of knowledge." Mary says, "He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts." Hannah says, "He raises up the poor from the dust to make them sit with princes." And Mary says, "He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble state." Hannah says, "Those who were hungry have ceased to hunger." And Mary says, "He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty." Hannah's song and the Magnificat mirror one another theologically to understand the way that God's work of salvation changes the world. For Hannah and her period, it's God's work through the prophets. Those fail. And so Mary comes about to bear another son. And that son is also given over to serve God. And it's Mary's faithfulness and her song that echoes back to the choices of faithfulness that Hannah made that allow Mary's purpose to be fulfilled in a way that changes and saves the entire world. And that's why Hannah's matters. Thanks for being here, and we'll be with Abigail next week.